Hi everyone, it's Kim from the Shamrock Quilt Studio, and I'm here today because I've had a couple of comments and questions about the tool that I use when I'm hand quilting. I have a little self-made tool that I'd like to share with you in case you were interested in doing something similar to it. Now, to start out with, I need to give a little disclaimer because I don't do a rocking stitch when I quilt. There may be some times that I do something like that, or a running stitch maybe towards the edges of my quilts. But in the area that I'm quilting, that I need to be the presentation of the quilt, where I really want it to look good, what I use is something like a stab stitch. And I have some physical limitations that have led me to determine that that's the best way for me to quilt. Maybe someday I'll get there to be able to use the other rocking method, but for today and so far that hasn't happened. So when we're quilting, we might use a template like this that has a pre-stamped out design, and we take this and we either, if we're very talented, we may use this and stitch it, but usually what we do is we mark it either with a disappearing pen, or sometimes you would use a very light touch on a pencil. I personally wouldn't use that method because I'd be terrified it would never come out. But I know some people do that. Or you might use something with chalk that you pounce on it, but there are these templates. So what I thought about was the fact that if you could have a template for your design, why couldn't you have a template for a design you wanted to quilt that you made yourself? And then that led me to think about, why couldn't I have some type of little guide that I used that could help me keep my stitches even and straight? Because it's a little more difficult when you're working that stab stitching to keep it straight. So what I started doing is I started taking this material and just cutting strips out. Usually they're about 1.5 inches wide, but you could make them any shape you wanted to, or any size. And what I do is I just use these markings here on the material to guide me where I need to make those stitches. And I'll put that there on the white so you can see a little better. There's all these little markings here that you can either take an 1/8 inch stitch, or you can take a 1/4 inch stitch, or something in between, whatever. And because I sew right along the edge of this, that keeps my line straight. Now I'll tell you, after you do it a while, what you'll discover is that your needle hitting the edge of this is going to make that mark disappear. And I've got a way to solve that as well. So if you're going to make this, the best way to do it is to get a piece of gridded template plastic. And this is made by Dritz. I used to buy this at Joann's. They always had it back in the section with the hoops and the templates that they had similar to this, and probably their triangles were on the same row. But it is available through Amazon, and it may be available at your local quilt store as well. I'm just not sure. So how do I make it? Well, first of all, I try not to use any of my plastic rulers to help me make it, because what will happen is we're going to use an X-Acto knife, and that X-Acto knife is going to make a gouge in the edge of your plastic, and then when you try to use your rotary cutter, it may not cut exactly correct, and you're also going to wear down that edge. So I would prefer and recommend that you not use this. If you can get a hold of a metal ruler, that would be best. And then you would just lay that metal ruler down and use your X-Acto knife to cut it. couple of things to warn you about. If you're going to cut on your cutting board that you use with your rotary cutter, flip it over, use the back side, maybe use a piece of cutting mat that is extra, or you could even cut it on a piece of wood, because that X-Acto knife is going to come through that plastic eventually to get it cut, and it's going to make deep gouges in your cutting mat that you would not normally see with a rotary cutter, and you don't want to ruin your cutting mat. But you could, like I said, you could use the back side of it if you wanted to do that. You could use a piece of wood. A heavy piece of cardboard would work too. The other option you have is, if you have a pair of scissors in your sewing room like I do, that are not dedicated solely to fabric but are used for other things, you could do that, and you could just cut very slowly and carefully along that line. You want to try to get it as smooth as possible, so you don't want to cut and take it away and cut and take it away. You want to keep that line really, really smooth. Then, how do you hook it to your quilt, your quilt top? Well, first of all, I cut some little holes with just a regular hole punch, usually about 4 or 5 inches apart, because I want to keep it as straight as I can on my working surface. And then I'm going to take some long pins, usually they're long quilting pins, and I'm going to stick it in one side and out the other, and I'm going to catch at least the top layer of the quilt in there. And when I line that up, however far I want from my seam, then that gives me a nice straight edge to sew along. And you're going to have to move it from time to time when you stitch however long it is. If it's really short, you're going to have to move it more often. If it's longer, you might not have to. The other thing is, you can cut it into shapes and squares. Now see this piece, let me bring this back over so you can see. This piece I use to sew this far from the seam. So that's where the seam line went, where my pieces went together, and then I sewed along this edge. And because I preserved corners on both sides, I was able to use that to sew on 2 connecting sides to give me a square in my quilting. You could also use this for other shapes that aren't necessarily square. You could draw on this plastic the shape that you wanted to. I don't know whether I have it or not. Let me look just a second. Well, I lost my camera battery and I didn't find what I was looking for, but I found something that might be helpful to explain what I'm talking about. And this is the copy that I made of something to be able to make one of these templates. And we can see that in our overhead, where this was the design that I used, and I made a template just like this out of this material. And it only was the lines were solid, so you had this section solid, you had these sections solid, and they were all hooked together in a 360 degree image of this. So it was a square shape of this kind of Celtic knot. And what I was trying to do was take a very complicated Celtic knot, make it into something simple, and then I used this to mark my quilting design on the squares so that they were all the same. And what we're doing by doing things that way is we're taking an old-fashioned idea where people made templates out of whatever they had, whether it was a cereal box or a piece of cardboard or just a piece of paper. Whatever they had, they made a template, and then they were able to mark their designs. And I think that's the way a lot of our quilters of years ago were able to keep that same design from one block to another is that they had some kind of template, and that's what we're using here. Now I'm going to put here's the label for the material that I've been using, and like I said, it is available on Amazon, and I'll put a link in the description of this. But you could really make a template out of anything you wanted to. If you wanted a round design, if you wanted a arch, if you wanted just about anything, if you wanted a petal shape, you could create the template out of this material and then simply sew around that, either by sewing around the actual template or by marking it to have that available to you. But it's a great way to personalize what you're quilting, especially if you're doing hand quilting, because it will allow you to be individual in your design, but also consistent from one block to another. I hope you found this helpful. Like I said, I had several questions about what kind of tool I use. I have used this for a long time because in the beginning, I was not very confident with my quilting skills and being able to keep that line straight. And as I started quilting, you know, I'd have a really long stitch and a little short stitch, and I wanted, if they weren't going to be tiny and they weren't going to be a little rocking stitch, I at least wanted them to be consistent. And this is an easy way to make it as consistent with as little skill as you may have to be able to pull that off. So that's my little advice for that. And like I said, it would be lovely to be able to do a rocking stitch, but for me right now that's not possible. So you adapt and do the best you can. So those are some examples of the templates and the tool that I use if you're interested in making your own. And I have gotten to where most of the time now I just cut them with the scissors, and as long as you just take your time and you're careful with that, you just don't leave any rough edges, you'll be fine. It's almost as difficult to do it with an X-Acto knife. So just the tools you need: something to cut with, you need to punch a hole so you can hold it in place, and you're off to the races. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope this little tip was helpful to you. If you like the content here, be sure to like us and subscribe to the channel. And we'll see you next week here at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Bye.